The desert wind roared like a blast furnace, ripping past the canopy of the P-47 Thunderbolt as Lieutenant Jack Reynolds gripped the control stick through his gloved hands. He was just 19. His face was streaked with sweat and grit, and his heart hammered like a battle drum. Below him, the sands of central Tunisia rolled out in endless waves of scorched gold, broken only by flashes of steel, German armor, dozens of tanks grinding toward a narrow ravine where over 800 American infantrymen were cornered with no escape. In his headset crackled the sharp voice of command. "Abort mission. Return to base. You are not cleared to engage." But Jack barely heard it. His lips moved in a whisper meant only for himself. "I'm not leaving them to die." He yanked the nose of the plane downward and dove. Engines screamed, sky blurred, and anti-aircraft fire clawed upward. In that instant, the war shifted. The rookie no one trusted, Jack Reynolds, the youngest pilot in his squadron, barely 19, was about to do what no one expected. He had never seen the ocean before shipping out, never flown over a real battlefield, never fired his guns outside of training. His hometown was a speck on the Kansas plains, flat fields, dusty roads, endless wheat. His father fixed engines. His mother sorted mail at the post office. He wasn't raised for heroism, but for hard work, modesty, and Sunday prayers. When he enlisted at 18, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, his grin was boyish, his voice quiet. He passed flight school faster than most, not for brilliance, but because the war needed men in the air. By 1943, America was bleeding pilots in North Africa. Dive bomber crews especially suffered staggering losses. 1 in 3 never returned. Jack knew the odds. Everyone did. When he first stepped into the squadron tent, the veterans sized him up. Some smirked. One called out, "Hey, Kansas! You here to fly or milk the cows?" They meant no harm, but no one expected much either. At first, he flew reconnaissance. Low risk, low expectation missions. He followed orders precisely, kept formation, avoided trouble. But he felt the war tugging at him. Watching from above wasn't enough. He wanted to matter, to protect the men fighting below. Nights found him awake on his cot, listening to distant shell fire, wondering what it felt like to be trapped down there, frightened, praying for rescue. He began volunteering more, asked to fly lead, asked for bombing runs. His commanding officer refused. "Not yet, Reynolds. You're too green." But Jack pressed on. "Sir," he said once, "I didn't come all this way just to circle the sky and go home." Still, command held firm, reconnaissance only. That's what he was doing on April 3, 1943, the day everything changed. The day a young pilot with no combat kills, no medals, and barely 100 hours in the air would get his chance to do the impossible. And take it. Early April in North Africa was merciless. The sun baked the ground into cracked clay, each step a battle against dust and heat. Tunisia, final battlefield of the desert campaign. American and British forces pressed hard, but Field Marshal Rommel's veterans wouldn't retreat without blood. Every ridge, every ravine, every rock formation became a death trap. That morning, the 45th Infantry Regiment received orders to move through a narrow valley west of Maknassi. It was supposed to be routine. Light resistance, quick progress, link up with armor by sundown. But war never goes to plan. Unseen by Allied scouts, German patrols had already spotted their approach. A counter-ambush was set. Before dawn, 3 companies of Panzer IVs, backed by artillery and infantry, moved quietly into position, surrounding the valley. By midday, the trap closed. The 45th was pinned, forward blocked by tank fire, retreat cut off by German shelling. Radios sputtered with broken signals. Operators cycled channels, desperate for a voice, any voice. Meanwhile, above, Jack Reynolds was airborne. His Thunderbolt climbed into formation with 5 others. Mission: high-altitude reconnaissance along Route 12. No engagement. Maintain altitude. Observe. Return. But minutes after reaching the target zone, Jack saw movement. Far too much for a convoy. Dust rose from tank treads. Muzzle flashes sparkled along the ridges. Smoke curled skyward. His gut tightened. Something was terribly wrong. Switching channels, he caught fragments of chaos. "We're pinned down! Need air support! Anyone read? They're all around us, north and west. For God's sake, where's our cover?" Jack recognized a voice. Private Earl McKinley from Alabama, the same soldier who once shared coffee and a photo of his newborn daughter. Now his voice was cracked with terror. The squadron leader's tone cut through. "All units pull west. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." One by one, the planes peeled away. Jack didn't. He stared down. The valley was a slaughterhouse. No artillery, no armor, no friendly aircraft. Just him. "Command, Lieutenant Reynolds," he radioed, requesting immediate strike authorization. "I have eyes on enemy armor closing on friendly troops." Silence then. "Negative, Reynolds. You are not cleared. Return to base," another voice screamed through the static. "We're getting torn apart. Where the hell's our air?" Jack checked his gauges. Fuel half full. 2,000 pounds of ordnance under his wings. He'd practiced this 100 times. Left, his wingman Connors still held formation. "Connors," Jack said, voice low but steady. "I'm going in." "What? Jack, are you insane? You heard the order?" No answer. Jack broke formation, nose down, into the inferno. Connors shouted, "Reynolds, pull up! You'll be shredded!" The wind shrieked louder than the radio. Flak bursts erupted in black clouds. The sky became a cage of shrapnel. His plane jolted hard, left wing hit, still holding. At 5,000 feet, he opened dive brakes. At 3,000, he aligned his sights. Tanks clustered at the ravine's mouth. At 1,500, he armed his bombs. "For Earl," he whispered. "For all of them." At 900 feet, he released. Both bombs fell clean. He pulled up with every ounce of strength, G-forces blurring his vision. The world rushed up like a wall. Then came the blast. A rolling fireball behind him. He was still flying. Barely. On the ground, soldiers stared in disbelief. A single plane diving through hellfire, punching a hole in the German line. A miracle, a madman, a savior. For several moments, the battlefield fell silent. The lead tank was gone, swallowed in flame. The one behind flipped on its side, tracks spinning. The rest halted in confusion. From below, it looked divine, like judgment descending from the heavens. But in the cockpit, Jack Reynolds fought to stay alive. His flaps were shredded. Alarms screamed. Smoke coiled from the engine. His throttle response was delayed. His controls felt like they were wrapped in molasses, but he was still flying. He checked his altitude 200 FT above ground. He was so low that he could see the faces of the infantry as he strew overhead. Young, dirty, wide-eyed, alive. He began to climb, coughing from the acrid smell of fuel and oil inside the cockpit. As he gained elevation, he could see the effect his dive had caused. German forces were disoriented. A few tanks were trying to reposition, but the natural bottleneck of the ravine had turned against them. Infantry units were scattering, diving for cover under the assumption that more planes were coming. But there were no more planes. There was only Jack. Back at base, the radio was in chaos. His squadron had returned, reporting Reynolds as missing or possibly shot down. The commanding officer paced furiously. Protocol had been broken. Unauthorized engagement. Possible loss of aircraft and pilot. Engagement. Possible loss of aircraft and pilot. Then came the impossible. A crackled report from the 45th Regiment's forward observer. "Whoever just hit the armor column. We're holding position. Enemy advance stalled. I repeat, advance stalled. You bought us time." Then came another voice. We saw it. One bird, one dive, took out the lead tanks, saved Oras's. I don't know who it was, but he's got a whole damn regiment in his debt. Back in the air, Jack turned the plane toward home. His fuel gauge was dangerously low. Oil pressure was dropping. The Thunderbolt was a tough bird, built to absorb damage, but it wasn't meant to fly after this much punishment. As he limped back toward base, he stayed low, hugging the terrain. Every vibration, every sputter in the engine could have meant the end. But he kept talking to the plane like it was alive. Come on, girl. Just a little farther. Don't quit on me now. When the runway came into view, he felt something between relief and dread. The base wasn't welcoming him home with applause. It was waiting with discipline. He touched down hard. The plane bounced once, skidded, then settled with a screech of tortured metal. Ground crews ran out with extinguishers, spraying down the engine before it could ignite. Jack climbed out, legs trembling, soaked in sweat. His commanding officer stormed toward him. "What the hell were you thinking?" The officer barked. "You disobeyed orders. You broke formation. You risked an entire aircraft." Jack said nothing. "You could have gotten yourself killed." Still silent, the officer took a breath to continue his tirade, but before he could, a young corporal ran over holding a radio set. "Sir, urgent report from Infantry Command." The officer turned annoyed. "What is it?" The corporal hesitated, then said, "They're saying Lieutenant Reynolds saved the 45th. Everyone froze. "The tanks are down, sir. The Germans are retreating from the ravine. Command is crediting the attack as the reason." There was a long silence. Jack finally spoke, voice steady. "I heard them on the secondary channel. They were dying down there." The officer stared at him, then walked away without another word. That night, Jack sat alone outside the hangar, still in his flight suit, sipping from a dented canteen. He didn't feel heroic. His hands still shook. His ears were still ringing from the dive. He had done the only thing that felt right. And even now, part of him expected consequences. But in that moment, with the stars above and the desert cooling around him, he knew something had changed. Not just for the men he saved, but for himself. He was no longer just the rookie. He was the one who did what no one else dared. Was he a hero or a fool? The next morning, the base was buzzing with whispers. Some pilots said Jack Reynolds was finished. Disobeying direct orders was no small matter. Even if his intentions had been noble, his actions were reckless, unauthorized, dangerous. The kind of behavior that got people killed or court-martialed. They said he was lucky to be alive, that his plane should have disintegrated mid-dive, that he had no business making that call. Others said something different. They said they wished they'd had the guts to follow him. That same morning, the report came in formal and typed with the crispness of military language. It stated that at 1400 hours on April 3rd, one enemy armor column consisting of no fewer than 11 German Panzer IV tanks and accompanying mechanized infantry was halted in its assault due to a precision air strike conducted by an unidentified American aircraft. The result, more than 200 U.S. infantrymen were able to retreat to defensible ground. Additional reinforcements arrived within the hour. Total lives saved, estimated between $400 and $600 German casualties, 37 killed, including one armored company commander. The airport didn't name Jack Reynolds, but by that evening, everyone knew. In Thimasol, men stood up when he entered, not with ceremony, not with applause, just quiet respect. A nod, a look. The way soldiers acknowledged something rare, something gutsy. Jack sat down with his tray, trying not to notice. He hadn't spoken to the commanding officer since landing. Hess still expected consequences. Maybe a formal reprimand, maybe grounding. He'd made peace with it. As far as he was concerned, he'd done what needed to be done. He didn't regret a second of it. Later that night, he was called to the command tent. He stood at attention, eyes forward. The officer behind the desk looked at him for a long time before speaking. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. "Yes, sir. You risked your aircraft, your life, and the success of the mission." "Yes, sir." And in doing so, you saved a regiment. Jack stayed silent. The officer leaned back in his chair. This war doesn't need cowboys, he said. It needs discipline. It needs men who follow orders even when it hurts. Jack nodded. I understand, sir. The officer studied him. But it also needs men who see what others can't, who act when no one else will. And sometimes, God help us, it needs men who break the rules to save lives. He stood up and walked over to Jack. He held out a piece of paper. Effective immediately, you are being recommended for the Silver Star. Jack blinked. You're also grounded for 1 week. Jack tried not to smile. Understood, sir. The officer nodded. Good. Now, go get some rest, Lieutenant. We'll need you back in the air soon. Word spread quickly. Jack Reynolds, the rookie everyone thought would wash out, was now the one with accommodation for valor. He didn't talk about it much. When asked, he'd just say, I saw what was happening. Someone had to do something. But the truth ran deeper than that. Jack hadn't just acted out of impulse. He'd acted out of conviction. He knew the cost. He'd calculated the risk. And still, he went in. In the weeks that followed, other pilots began flying lower, getting braver. They'd seen what was possible when one man trusted his gut over protocol. Command noticed it too. While official orders remained strict, more discretion was quietly given to experienced pilots. Use your judgment became the new phrase. And Jack flew 32 more missions over North Africa. He never broke formation again, not once. Not because he was afraid, but because he never had to. His squad followed him willingly. When he gave a command, they listened because they knew that Jack Reynolds, the farm boy from Kansas, had already proven everything that mattered. He had looked death in the face and dove straight into it. Not for glory, not for medals, but for the men on the ground, for Earl McKinley, for the voices on the other end of the radio who thought no one was coming. In private, some of the brass still debated his actions. Some said he got lucky, that if his bombs had missed, the 45th would have been slaughtered, that bravery without authorization was still dangerous. But others said something else. They said that in war you don't always get time to ask permission, that sometimes it's better to act and be punished than to wait and be too late. And the men whose lives he saved, they didn't care about the chain of command. They didn't care about flight regulations or command protocols. All they remembered was the sound of that engine screaming overhead, the flash of fire, the German tanks exploding, and the knowledge that someone somewhere had chosen to risk everything to save them. They never forgot that. Years later, one of the survivors, by then an old man with trembling hands, was asked about the day he almost died in Tunisia. He looked up, eyes glassy, and said, "We thought we were dead." Then, out of nowhere, this plane comes down like an angel falling out of heaven. One guy, one plane changed everything. And that's how legends are born. Not in the halls of power or the pages of reports, but in the memory of the men whose lives hung by a thread and were saved by someone who refused to let go. The bigger picture: courage versus discipline. Long after Jack Reynolds's bombing run became legend among the men of the 45th, his story echoed through the broader ranks of the United States Army Air Forces. Some heard it with admiration, others with discomfort, but everyone heard it. It sparked a quiet argument, one that had no easy answer. What matters more in war, obedience, or instinct? In April of 1943, American command doctrine was still rooted in hierarchy. Orders were orders. They were to be followed without question. The consequences of deviation were often severe. For good reason: chaos could cost lives. Undisciplined units collapsed under pressure. Pilots who freelanced didn't just risk themselves. They risked the entire mission. And yet, war itself was chaotic. It changed faster than any order could travel. From the foxholes of Italy to the skies over Tunisia, men often found themselves in situations that no field manual could predict. Jack's dive stirred that tension to the surface. On paper, what he did was wrong, but on the battlefield, it was right. Commanding officers who reviewed the incident were divided. The official recommendation for the Silver Star described Jack's actions as exceptional bravery under extreme pressure and instrumental in halting enemy advancement. But the fine print included the phrase, "despite deviation from standard air engagement protocol." That phrase was no accident. It was meant to draw a line to say this was a rare exception, not a rule. But the pilots didn't read it that way. In the barracks, over campfires, and in the cramped tents near the front, Jack's name came up often. Not because he was flashy. Jack's name came up often. Not because he was flashy. He wasn't. In fact, he barely spoke of what he'd done. He didn't posture. He didn't tell Thestry unless someone else brought it up. That humility made it resonate even more. One pilot, a veteran named Captain Lawrence Hawk Hawthorne, put it this way: "Every war has its cowboys, guys who fly hot, show off, break rules, and get people killed." Jack wasn't one of them. What made him different was that he knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. Not for himself, for them, for the boys on the ground. Statistically, solo dive-bombing missions like Jack's were considered high-risk, low-reward. Precision was hard. The window to drop bombs accurately while avoiding ground fire was a matter of seconds. Most such runs ended in failure or worse. But when they worked, they could change everything. Dive bombing had become a specialty of American air tactics, particularly with the introduction of the Douglas SBD Dauntless and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. These aircraft were tough, fast, and built to take punishment. But no aircraft was invincible. Dive bombing placed pilots in the most vulnerable position possible. Low, slow, exposed. Pilots were trained to avoid solo dives whenever possible. And yet Jack had made one on instinct in the heat of battle with no backup. His success opened a quiet door, not in policy, at least not officially, but in mindset. Commanders began issuing more flexible instructions, not lax, but open-ended. Orders started including phrases like, "use your best judgment" or "react based on field conditions." These weren't random. They were a nod, unspoken, unofficial to men like Jack Reynolds. The war was changing. It demanded more than machines and maps. It demanded human judgment, moral judgment. Jack's case became a whispered precedent. Other pilots began to act more boldly, not recklessly, but with conviction. They planned their runs better. They trained harder. They studied terrain more closely. They wanted to be ready if a moment came where no one else would act, and some of them got their moment. In Italy, a pilot broke formation to destroy a bridge that wasn't on the target list, only to discover later that the bridge had been the Germans' main supply route. In France, a bomber crew rerouted mid-flight to avoid a trap and accidentally stumbled on an armored convoy, taking it out before it could reach the front. None of these actions were officially credited to Jack Reynolds, but the pilots who made them all knew his name. Even years later, long after the war ended, long after North Africa and Italy and France were just chapters in a history book, Jack's name still floated through veteran halls, reunions, and faded letters home. He had become something rare, not a myth, not a cautionary tale, but a symbol. A symbol of the moment when the rigid spine of military order met the flexible heart of human courage and bent just slightly in the right direction. Jack himself never claimed any of that. When interviewed decades later by then an old man with white hair and sun-worn skin, he simply said, "I didn't do anything special. I just saw men in trouble, and I was the only one up there who could do something about it." That humility was the final lesson. Courage wasn't about ego. It wasn't about medals or headlines or being remembered. It was about doing the right thing, especially when it cost you something, especially when no one else would. And in that way, Jack Reynolds wasn't just a pilot. He was a mirror held up to every soldier who ever faced a moment of choice. Follow the order or follow your gut. Risk punishment or risk letting others die. There's no easy answer. But Jack gave us one possibility. Sometimes, in the heart of the worst kind of war, the best kind of man makes the hardest kind of choice. and carries it for the rest of his life, not as a hero, but as a human being who did what was right when it mattered most. The men he saved. For most of those on the ground that day in Tunisia, everything after the explosion felt like a dream. One moment, they were bracing for death. The next, they were stumbling to their feet, wide-eyed, stunned, watching smoke curl from the wrecks of the lead German tanks. The crushing pressure that had held them seconds before, gone, shattered by the precise fury of one pilot. In the confusion of battle, details vanish. No one knew his name. No one saw his face. All they remembered was a streak of silver plunging from the clouds, the flash of bombs, and the silence that followed. But that silence meant life. For hundreds of soldiers in the 45th Infantry, that brief pause gave them a chance to dig in, reorganize, and survive. Some couldn't believe it had even happened. Private Earl McKinley, the same young man whose terrified voice Jack had heard over the radio, recalled peering out from behind a broken boulder and whispering, "Did God just drop that bomb?" For days afterward, the survivors tried to make sense of it. The engineers later confirmed that the lead tank had carried a mobile command post, maps, radios, even the enemy commander himself. Its destruction left the rest of the German column blind, and in the few minutes it took them to recover, American reinforcements arrived. The window created by Jack's dive had turned the tide of the fight. Years later, at a reunion in Colorado Springs, old men with gray hair and rows of medals sat around a fire and spoke of that day. Most had forgotten the small details, the names, the orders, the dust, but none forgot the dive. "He came out of nowhere," one said. "Just one of ours, diving like he wanted to kiss the earth." Then, boom. "It was like the sky answered us." Another added, "We always said, if we ever met that pilot, we'd buy him a drink, maybe two." And eventually, some of them did. In 1961, almost 20 years after the war, Jack Reynolds received a letter from a veteran named Harold Miles, a former radio technician with the 45th. He had found Jack through service records and veteran registries. He didn't ask for anything. He just wrote, "You saved my life. I don't know if you even remember what you did, but I do. My kids do. Every year on April 3rd, I tell them that was the day a man I never met gave me a second chance." Jack wrote back, humble as ever, saying only that he was glad Harold made it home. He never called himself a hero, never mentioned the Silver Star. He simply signed, "All the best, Jack." More letters came. Soldiers from the regiment thanked him. Some called him their guardian angel. Others just said, "We saw you, and we never forgot." Many of those men went on to live remarkable lives. One became a principal, another a congressman, others built businesses. Earl McKinley became a chaplain for returning Vietnam veterans, offering the same comfort he once received from the man in the sky who didn't leave them behind. None of it would have happened if Jack hadn't acted. After the war, Jack didn't chase fame. He married a nurse he'd met in England, settled in Oregon, and became a flight instructor. He trained hundreds of young aviators to read the clouds, trust their planes, and, quietly, to trust themselves. He rarely spoke about Tunisia, not to his students, not to the press. When asked what made a good pilot, his answer was always the same: someone who knows when to pull the trigger and when not to. But those who truly knew him, his wife, his children, his fellow instructors, understood. Jack Reynolds wasn't just teaching men how to fly, he was teaching them how to choose. Because in April 1943, when everything told him to turn back, when every rule said it was madness, he made a decision. One that echoed through lives for decades. And maybe that's the real measure of a legacy. Not how loudly it's remembered, but how deeply it's felt by those who lived because of it. Jack Reynolds passed away peacefully in the summer of 2007, at the age of 83. The obituary in the small Oregon paper was brief. It mentioned his service in World War II, his years as an instructor, his love for fishing, and the family he left behind. It didn't mention the dive. It didn't mention Tunisia. It didn't have to. Those who knew already understood. At his funeral, a man in his 80s stood by the grave, clutching a folded flag. Harold Miles, the same radio operator who had written decades before, leaned down and placed a letter on the coffin. On the outside, 5 words, April 3rd, 1943. Thank you. Inside was a copy of the message Jack had sent home all those years ago, retrieved from a military archive. If I don't make it, tell Dad I'd rather die doing the right thing than live doing nothing. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't grand, but it was true. And in its quiet defiance, it carried the weight of every soldier who's ever stood at the crossroads of duty and choice. Because wars are built from moments, not speeches or sweeping victories, but split-second decisions made with no promise of survival. A pilot hears a plea over the radio. A soldier steps forward when others freeze. A man dives alone into a sky full of fire. Most of those moments fade, but not this one. This one left its mark, not in medals or textbooks, but in lives. Real, breathing lives. Jack Reynolds didn't die in battle, but he risked everything for those who might have, and that risk became his legacy. Not carved in stone, but living in the hearts of men who once saw his shadow pass overhead. When all hope was gone in that single dive, Jack became more than a pilot. He became a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That orders matter, but conscience matters more. So if you remember nothing else about this story, remember this: a 19-year-old kid from Kansas, alone in the sky with orders to turn back, chose instead to dive toward danger. Not for glory, not for fame, but because it was right. And hundreds of men lived because of it. What moved you most? The dive? The defiance? Or what came after? Tell us in the comments below. Tell us in the comments below.